The book is called Whitlams Children, and as many of you know, the title doesn't come from Whitlam, it comes from the Greens, making a relationship between the Greens as a progressive force and the Labour Party as a progressive force. What Sean has done, which is astonishing, is to spend time as a kind of translator in the Commonwealth Parliament, working his way through, listening to one set of progressive voices, listening to another set of progressive voices, testing each other on the various ways they understand what the progressive project is all about. And then he's got out of Canberra in order to try and work out where the real life of the progressive mind in Australia fits within this story. Having completed his PhD, he had the rash, unprogressive ambition to get it published. Went to Melbourne University Press, Australia's most prestigious academic publisher, and took me totally by surprise. It's like a 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 chance that they'd publish somebody's PhD. They don't even look at the PhDs, they just say no. But they said yes to this one. Why did they say yes? Well, it's gracefully written, well thought out and gracefully written. But it's also on a topic that I think MUP appreciates is going to be cemented into Australian politics over the next decade or so. And it's really partly a confusion, but also the creative friction in progressive sentiment in Australia to try and work out relationships between two altogether coherent and honourable forces that sometimes trust, sometimes distrust one another. What we're going to do tonight is get Sean to speak about his book. Then Shane's going to speak as a Greens minister, perhaps the most powerful Greens member in Australian Parliament. He's not just representing his party, he's in government with Labor in a kind of creative and interesting way that reflects well, I think, on ACT politics, certainly well on Shane, but also well on Australia, that somehow we can accommodate and welcome that kind of relationship. All of us will have good reasons to think that one party is the honourable one, the other one's the slightly less honourable one, but having them work together is really what the task is all about. We've had the Victorian election, and you know the kind of creative confusion that's given all across Australia, and the eddies and impact that that's had on the Commonwealth Parliament. So I think the book and the theme is really a significant one. Where is the author of the book? Can we invite the author, Sean Crow, to come up and speak?
Okay. Thanks, Shane, for saying yes to this. Also, thanks to Chris Endry, who helped organise this, on the Canberra's foremost short-swearing comedian. Also, thank you, everyone, for turning up. I've launched this in a few other cities, but I think it's fitting that we end this gruelling book tour in the true People's Republic. We heard a lot about Victoria on the weekend, but after 6 years here, it's also, I would call, finally my hometown launch. So this book, yes. So this book began as a PhD thesis at the ANU in early 2013. So at the back end of Julia Gillard's minority government, it was a time when the Labor-Greens relationship was probably at its most prominent in Australia, but also I think we can all remember at its most ragged. And it began with what at the time I thought was a broadly ecumenical spirit. And I thought, and perhaps this was a naive aspiration, that by talking to both parties I could help provide maybe a level of mutual understanding and perhaps even create, or not create, but facilitate a more self-aware and robust relationship. And yes, you might laugh at this mission, and there were issues from the start. So my first set of interviews were postponed because both parties essentially organised dueling press conferences to denounce each other on a piece of long-forgotten tax legislation. Another set was held during Senate week when the Senate was debating changes to voting reform, and this week that ended with, I think, Sam Dastyari describing the Greens as cancer. So there is obviously, and anyone who watched the Victorian election would know, there is a level of tribal bitterness between the two parties, and to some degree this is inevitable when you have two sets of people fighting over the same voters, the same activists, often the same kind of progressive oxygen. But I do think at times, particularly in Parliament, it can be a destructive bitterness. And I kind of wrote the book for people to maybe reflect on it more maturely. So the first chapter of the book kind of sketches out some of the party history of the two-party system in Australia from Federation up until Kevin Rudd's election. And I started here because I think some of this history does provide some instructive lessons for contemporary parties, particularly on the kind of necessity of some level of good faith across the broad progressive left in Australia, even if it does at times seem difficult. So we tend to think of the Australian party system and the Australian history of party politics as incredibly rigid and characterised by a kind of remarkable stability. And on some level this is true, but I think on a kind of deep level there's a more interesting history where parties have splintered and cracked and formed anew. If you look at the first 50 years of Australian party politics, the Conservative side of politics in this country changed its name and identity 3 times, the same amount of times that the Labor Party formally split. And a lot has been written, in Australian history about these splits, but one thing is clear, which is that the kind of nature of these splits had enormous and reverberating consequences for the success of the Labor Party in this country. So we saw this after the conscription debates, and I think people sometimes forget this, but the Labor Party governed for a total of 2 years between the wars after the deep divisions around voting on conscription during World War I. We saw it again after the DLP split, when parts of the Catholic bloc in Australia deliberately used their preferences to hurt Labor and ended in 22 years in opposition. And it really was only in the 1980s when Bob Hawke was able to form kind of productive and useful relationships with the Democrats and the kind of forming of the original Green movement that the preferential system actually assisted the Labor Party in Australia. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this happened to correspond with Labor's longest ever period in government. So it was with this knowledge I wanted to study this relationship, which seemed important, to examine what differences between the parties were kind of structural and immovable, and which were perhaps more open to reform and change. And because of the timing, I wanted to understand particularly the first minority government since World War II, so the minority government of Julia Gillard. And there are other minority experiments in Australia, and Shane can perhaps talk a little bit about his experiences in the ACT. But one way I did this was interviewing a lot of politicians from both sides. And if you do buy the book, you'll see that both parties were very generous and open in assisting me with this, with their time and their people. The first thing to note from the interviews was that broadly across both parties, there was some sense of pride that most politicians held in the Gillard minority government. A kind of sense that the period was progressive, ambitious, and in the end remarkably stable for the situation that there was. And both parties cited quite similar achievements as proof of the some of the enduring successes of that minority government. So things like disability insurance, things like education reform, and things like the clean energy package. And you saw within the Labor Party about half of the respondents say that, well, Gillard may have been dealt a difficult hand, but in the end she played it as well as she could have, and based on those reforms you have to say it was somewhat of a success. There was, however, a second group within Labor who expressed some concerns with the period. A group who were less optimistic about the experiment. And they generally began with the stark observation that the period of minority government ended with the election of its most brutal, relentless and frankly hopeless critic, Tony Abbott. Well, he wasn't hopeless at being a critic, he was very good at that. And within Labor's caucus, there was a sense across a number of people that the situation was a burden for the Prime Minister, one that the government happened to overcome at times, but which nonetheless held them back in the end. This was either because minority government itself sits uneasily within the Australian political tradition, or because the period of post-election bargaining led to compromises which made the government look duplicitous, or because just the association with the Greens repelled some swing voters that Labor needed to govern. And while these people were careful not to blame Gillard personally, they did say that in the end, based on this, you'd have to say the experiment was a failure. Greens politicians on the whole were much more positive about the experience. Perhaps it is unsurprising. It's their closest look into legislative power on a federal level. But they themselves were kind of hemmed in by the same essential bind, which was for them a period of parliamentary success ended in electoral failure. So the Greens themselves lost about a third of their vote after 2010 as well. And Greens politicians such as Lee Rhiannon thought that because of this, the Greens party had to be themselves quite cautious about entering an association again and being pulled into what they see as the muck of major party politics. I don't know what other people think. This is not to say that policy compromise itself was always easy. Some of the most vicious disputes between the parties, and this started in Tasmania in 1989 when the Greens first kind of got their way into Parliament, are over intense environmental disputes which divide the conservationists in its territory with industrial workers. And we saw this, as from Tasmania, but also in periods of carbon pricing. And this is likely to continue, I think, as long as the economy depends on parts of it on extraction. There's also the fact that the Greens, if they want to grow, have an interest in wedging Labor on some of the big social progressive issues of the day. And this itself is kind of central to parts of their electoral strategy. But in the end, I don't think this, as difficult as these dilemmas are dilemmas that can be indefinitely ignored. Daniel Andrews did very well on Saturday night to avoid minority government. But you can easily envisage a situation where a future shortened federal government could be held back by a poor relationship with the Greens, particularly in the Senate. So thank you all for coming. I think it's a conversation that will continue, and thank you for having it with me. Thanks.
You are the most senior responsible Greens member in Australia, now as Minister. You've watched politicians come and go, you've survived, you've been elevated, you've once a Speaker, now a Minister. Some responses, please.
Thanks, John. Firstly, Sean, congratulations on the book. I'm obviously biased, but I think it's a really interesting topic to explore and to look at both the history of Green Labor relationships in Australia and the potential future of that, because as you rightly observed at the end of your comments, this is potentially a pathway that we may see and a construct we might see on future occasions. For the Greens, we're still a young party. The Labor Party, of course, has their great tradition of 120 odd years now. The Greens, we've just celebrated our 25th birthday. Here in the ACT, we've now held the balance of power for 10 years. Literally last month we marked that anniversary, and so we continue to evolve as a party, and the playing a role in government is one that is still an evolving concept for our party. For a party that's come from a proud history of activism, of protest movement and the like. There are those who have spent their entire lives being stone throwers, people who've literally operated from the outside and tried to tear down some of the excesses of government and use that real sense of activism to get change and to drive social revolution. And so then coming into a role of actually being a partner in a government is a really interesting evolution for our party, one that we've lived here in the ACT, but has also been a very significant debate for our membership across the country through the number of experiments we've now had. Tasmania, of course, being the leader, including a period where Christine Milne, as the leader of the Greens in the Tasmanian Parliament, actually support a Liberal government. And that, of course, is a point of considerable debate. Christine will still speak to the significant achievements of that government, including the very significant gun law reform that took place after the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, to point to the fact that whilst it can be an odd arrangement at times, the Greens need to be open to entertaining that idea of, to be a balanced power party, do you need to be prepared to have a partnership with the Liberal Party at times as well? And I think that debate has probably moved a long way in recent years, where for most members of our party that would not be seen to be an acceptable outcome, and I think would challenge most of our members. That, of course, puts you in a position where it diminishes to some extent your ability to negotiate with the Labor Party. If they know you will not form a partnership with the Liberal Party, then you move quickly into the territory of being taken for granted. These are interesting questions that our party seeks to work on as we go through that period of the increased opportunities to play a role in government. Before my life in politics, I was a political advisor for Greenpeace here in Canberra. It was kind of my dream job as a person coming out of university. I got this job working for Greenpeace. was a strange role because Greenpeace, of course, is known for activism and all these kind of things, and I walked the corridors of Parliament House in a suit trying to do the Greenpeace job there. It was a strange role, but people used to say to me, is it easier to lobby the Labor Party or the Liberal Party? And my answer to that became, well, with the Liberal Party, if you ask them for something, they'll just tell you to, they'll say no to your face. Let's put it that way. We're being recorded and I promise not to swear. But and I lived that experience. I became a lobbyist for Greenpeace in 1998 in the early years of the Howard government and dealt with ministers like Rod Kemp, Warwick Perer as the Resources Minister. Whereas the Labor Party, I'd say, mate, no worries, put the arm around the shoulder and then they go and knife you later. That was my experience as a Greenpeace lobbyist and it informed me a bit coming into politics. But here in the ACT we found ourselves, when I was first elected in 2008, in that position where we suddenly won the balance of power and we had to sit down and start negotiating. And I think the first reflection I can offer out of that is that the personalities across the table matter a great deal. In 2008, we came into the balance of power with John Stanhope as the Chief Minister. John had held majority government in his own right for the 4 years prior to that. He resented the fact that he did not have power in his own right, and that played out for his entire relationship with the Greens in the period in which we held the balance of power. He wisely assigned Katie Gallagher to be the one who dealt with the Greens, because John just resented having to do it. And what we then saw was an entirely different relationship, particularly once Katie became the Chief Minister. And in 2012, when I held the balance of power by myself, we had 8 Labor, 8 Liberal and just myself, and Katie invited us to join the ministry. We saw an entirely different relationship of how one could do a collaborative government. Where I remember saying to Katie as we discussed the issue of whether I'd go into cabinet and what happened if we disagreed, she just looked at me and laughed and said, "What, you don't think we disagree with each other in the Labor Party?" And it was a really fair and good observation in the sense that it underlined the fact that they were not, in themselves not homogenous and that cabinet debates could be quite fierce. I think they've toned it down because there's now a Green sitting in there. I think they have these pre-cabinet caucus meetings because I never see that, or rarely see those fierce debates go on these days. But I think what the Greens bring to these relationships is, and Sean draws this out quite well in his book, is that the Labor Party necessarily seeks to appeal to a broad audience. And you've got the SDA at one end of the Labor Party and, Lean at the other end of the Labor Party and everything in between. And I think what the Greens have done, and we've certainly, I think, played this role in the ACT, is that we're prepared to come in and float issues when perhaps not the entire community is ready for it. Our membership's ready for it. The community organisations will be advocating for it. But a mainstream political party is not ready to go there. But we are, and we'll float things, and we'll push for things. The example I've put from 2008, we walked into the negotiations with Stanhope and said, we want to legislate a greenhouse gas reduction target, and we want 40%, because that is what the IPCC is telling us we should be doing. And it's what the UN climate negotiations had just agreed. And I had just finished my previous job with Greenpeace, was at the climate negotiations as a political advisor. And I came into ACT politics and said, well, this is the global standard, we should adopt it here in the ACT. Again, for not wanting to swear in front of camera, let's just say John's answer involved expletives. But ultimately we got there. We agreed we'd have a legislative target. We then had a committee process and we set a 40% reduction target. And I think what that debate did was our pushing for it enabled those in the Labor Party who agreed with us to drive that along in the Labor Party. And then what's been really interesting was once that became our standard, we've been able to follow it through for 10 years. And so the ACT is now a national climate leader because two things. We set a bold policy ambition at the beginning and we've had 10 years of stable government to follow it through. You contrast it to the national situation and you can see why we've made so much progress. Pill testing's another one. I talked about pill testing last term. The initial reaction from the ALP was no. 2 years later, Minister Fitzharris has just issued a press release, literally 2 hours ago, claiming pill testing is one of the great achievements of ACT Health in 2018. And so, that's fine because it took all of us to get there ultimately. But it's that ability for us, I suppose, to push things that the ALP isn't quite there for that I think is a really important part of that relationship. I was really struck in Sean's book by the different responses from the ALP interviewees and the Greens interviewees about the nature of the relationship. and the opportunities for future coalitions in particular. What you saw from the Greens predominantly was people going, yeah, that'd be great. Multi-party government, it's creative, brings different perspectives to the table, we can get a mature relationship, we can work together. And what you saw from the ALP on the whole was no way. Why should we? And this I think demonstrates a bit of probably a difference of where the parties are at. The ALP expects to govern. They expect to govern, and it's a right of being in the Labor Party is that you will be the government at some point. And I've seen this when I go to the COAG table. One of the interesting ones the last few years has been the Energy Council, doing the neg. What's really interesting is when you turn up to a negotiation like that, all the ministers from all the jurisdictions know who the green guy is in the corner. It's kind of like you walk in with a neon sign on you. But what's evident in any of those, Energy Council's the most obvious one, but all of them, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, they just sit there and they have this funny banter where they know that ultimately one or other of them will be the government. And their turn is coming. It's just a matter of time. It's a very different expectation to being a small party that is really issues driven and really just wants to get in there and make stuff happen. It's cultural. I don't say it to be pejorative about the ALP, it's just a different cultural frame that they come from. And I think it's very interesting and demonstrates why Sean got such different responses in his book. I could probably talk about this all night, but I think we're going to have a Q&A, so I might stop there, other than to say, I think what we have demonstrated in the ACT is it is possible. I actually think it's worked really well. And again, I'm biased because I'm in it. But what we have learnt is we have a very powerful relationship here in the ACT where we have built a level of trust over time. We know how to fight with each other. It's done in a way where we'll just actually walk down the corridor and say, all right, we're going to disagree on this, how are we going to deal with it? And it's not sort of slingy matches in the press and these kind of things. We don't leak on each other. And I think that trust has been a really important part of building a relationship where we all grumble at each other. We'll sit in our party and go, oh, and I'm sure they do the same about us. I have no doubt they roll their eyes at us a lot. But, at the end of the day, the numbers in the parliament dictate that we must work together, and we must work together for the people of the ACT. And I think we've found a way to do that. And I think it demonstrates it can be done. It can be done really well, and it can be really effective, because what we're achieving in the ACT in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, we've just passed amendments to the Discrimination Act to deal with the issue of religious schools being allowed to discriminate. That's why I was a bit late. We just literally divided on that and passed it at about 6:02 tonight. We can get those things done because there is that collaboration there. But let me leave it there. Congratulations, Sean, on writing the book, getting it published, and I look forward to the further discussion. Thanks very much.
The event doesn't end until you've bought your second copy, so it could take a few minutes. Both the speakers are quite happy to stay on the stage for 10, maybe 11 minutes or so. So it's back to the floor to put questions to either of the two speakers. Very happy to see you from here. Yes?
Hi. So as a Victorian migrant who sort of was involved in Victorian ALP politics a couple of years ago and is now under a very different environment in the ACT, what strikes me is that the difference in terms of the level of not just trust within, say, the ACT Labor Party towards the ACT Greens versus in Victoria, but also I think the difference in its kind of ideological common language. There's a very strong attitude inside the Victorian ALP that the Victorian Greens are basically just liberals who are too young to vote Liberal yet. It's very much a party of inner city merchant bankers, and that, whereas by contrast, I think what I've noticed in the ACT is there seems to be a genuine respect within ACT Labor that the ACT Greens are a genuinely left-of-centre progressive force. I'd be interested, Shane, what's your view on why it is that in the ACT politics, the two parties have been able to work together and find such common ground, whereas in Victoria there seems to be political, electoral, cultural, ideological, very sharp divisions between the two?
I think it's a couple of factors. Firstly, the competition is not as direct here because we have the multi-member electorates and just the history of the way the ACT community votes. In Victoria, you've got literally, going head to head in seats like Brunswick and Richmond and the like, and Batman and all those things. So you've got that very direct competition going on. Whereas here, the ALP largely knows in a 5-member electorate, they're going to win 2, the Libs are going to win 2, and the important question is who wins the 5th seat, which is mostly not the majors. And the question is, does it become a Conservative independent or a Green? And so there's this kind of, whilst there's a competition there, there's also an acknowledgement of perhaps the reality of how that's going to play out. So I think that helps. Probably the other factor I would add is that being a smaller place, we know each other, and a lot of the sort of criticisms you're talking about, those kind of observations, often come from when just people don't know each other. It's that dislike or fear of the other, which plays out in all sorts of ways, immigration debates and all those kind of things. And it's that in a different environment, I think, is the other factor. I'm sure there's also just some local history and those kind of things which are different. And the Greens are different in different places as well, and that's part of we're not quite as evolved in that sort of sense of being more strictly grouped into particular branches and particular brands in the way I think the ALP is.
On the kind of tree Tory thing, I think it's true that the Greens are a party of educated people, whereas they don't have the same base in the kind of outer suburban ethnic communities that Labor do. But I think the kind of tree Tory merchant bank line does ignore the nature of modern class lines. I think there are a lot of people who are young, who have good educations, who might be outwardly, have cultural capital, but nonetheless kind of insecure, working in contracts, still look to government to kind of intervene in the economy in ways which can assist their lives. And I think the Greens do try to win voters like that. I think Labor tries to win voters like that. I would argue that in a place like Britain, Jeremy Corbyn's kind of whole social base are in people who are educated but still precarious. So I think our conventional notion of class is as people in either blue-collar work or bankers, I think needs to be a bit more nuanced. And I think that plays out within the Labor Party as much as the Greens as well.
Thank you. Sean, it's very loud. This is probably a question for you directly. So you looked at the history of the parties. Where do you see, both federally and within the states, this sort of coalition building between the two parties going? Is it something that Victoria needs to worry about, something New South Wales will ever have to worry about? Or is it a consistent thing that federal Labor has to concern itself with?
I think in the end it's a kind of pragmatic question of how many seats the Greens win and whether that is enough to occupy the balance of power. I think in different states it's easier to have a productive relationship. I think if you were to design a state or a polity that was most conducive to Labor-Greens cooperation, it would be the ACT. You don't have any big kind of environmental disputes. Really, the Labor base is much more middle class than it would be in other places, so you don't have as sharp divisions over those big social progressive questions. I think Tasmania would be the state you would design to be least conducive to cooperation, where you have these historic, massive economic disputes over the environment, but also cultural disputes between people who live in isolated forestry communities and people who go to Mona on the weekend. I think it is a question of how many seats the Greens win, but I think the path to collaboration or conflict would be very different in different places.
One or two more questions? Yes, in the back corner. Come up here, Mike.
G'day. Ooh, that is loud. I guess questions for both, but probably more to yourself. And sorry, I'm only just recently local, so I've forgotten your name already. But in the election that we've just seen passed, the Greens have this internal battle between being the party of protest or the party that will win seats and negotiate with government, yada yada. Why be the party of protest and then get upset when you don't win votes? And is that something that's going to continue to happen? Is that like a not a generational, but like an existential sort of battle that is going on? And I don't know, Sean can answer as well.
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and there is no doubt that within our party there are those who would happily not win seats. They just want to get out there and they want to raise the issues and they want to drive the agenda and they want to be true to the issue and those sort of things. But, my argument has always been we are a political party. If you want to be like that, work in an NGO. The point of being in a political party is that your objective is to win seats in Parliament. And I've always held the view that, if we think that our policies are the best policies that are out there, which by dint we do, then of course we should be trying to get into Parliament and win as much power as we can to implement those policies, because otherwise, why are we bothering putting them together? It's the same reason why part of our philosophy in taking a role in the ministry is that you have an opportunity there to take your policies and have as many levers as possible to implement them, and why wouldn't you do that if you're a political force? But there is, to pick up on your point, there is a difference of view within our party, and it's the heritage of the party to some extent. As I touched on earlier, it's a party of activists. I mean, really, the Greens come from the Franklin. If you want to look at the cultural heritage of the party, in Australia at least.
Lake Pedder.
Well, true. And the United Tasmania Group, I do know my history, but put on the spot, I forgot it. But it is that real activist sort of history, and so that's deeply ingrained. And in the same way that, I'm always struck by just how deeply ingrained the union stuff is in the Labor Party. It comes up in the strangest ways sometimes when you don't see it coming. And that stuff, it infects the culture of an organisation in a way that's not always obvious, but is really important.
John?
Just quickly, I mean, it seems like I don't know about the Victorian situation, because I think they are trying to win seats very hard. But I think the New South Wales Party, and the split we've seen over the last 3 weeks or so, seems very much to emanate from that essential question. And again, to bring up Larry Ann, because I interviewed her, and she's perhaps not the most representative member, but she's had interesting responses. But she essentially said that the point of the Greens is to amplify social movements, and then you had the other flank of the party in New South Wales who said the point of the Greens is, as Shane said, to take power, and that's the kind of heart of the fight, to take over the New South Wales kind of apparatus of the party. So yes, I would agree.
We've got 2 or 3 minutes.
I'm just wondering whether the Greens and Labor, whether it's ultimately like a negative sum game where only one can increase at the expense of the other. Perhaps in Germany recently, the Greens overtook the Social Democrat Party, and I guess the question is whether it's just one. There's a total amount of left votes, and it goes between the two, or whether there's something different about the Greens or a Social Democratic Party that means that the overall net amount of votes increases for the left.
I would like to think that we could increase the pie. The more progressive voters, the better. And I think that there are differences between the Greens and the ALP. I think there's a lot of commonality, but there are differences. And if there's an opportunity there for us to appeal to a different group of people, then that's great. And there's people who will vote for the ALP that will never vote for us. And if we are smart about it, you can build the progressive vote, and that is, I think, quite a valuable thing. I was just reflecting on that and the previous question. I was also reminded of a comment that Bob Brown made many, many years ago when asked about the future of the Greens and sort of whether we would like the Democrats and whether we should in fact merge with the Democrats. Fortunately, we didn't. But Bob at the time said, look, we're not here to keep the bastards honest, we're here to kick the bastards out. And I think that in itself is quite an important understanding of where the party wants to be. And I think of the political ambition of the party. It's not about sort of being on the fence and just sort of keeping it even between the two. It's actually about fundamentally changing the way the parliament works and the outcomes that come from the parliament.
I think the Victorian example on the weekend, there's all this dispute over why the Greens did slightly worse than they did last election, whether it was internal bickering within the Greens or whatever. But I think it was basically that the Andrews government won more progressive votes than last election. So I think there is a big kind of zero-sum element to it, and I think it's a pretty good characterisation of the German situation. Partly, I mean, the Social Democrats have lost ground to the Greens because the Social Democrats have been in very close association with the centre-right party, with Merkel's government, which has given the Greens much more oxygen there.
Thank you. I guess this is a history one in the sense that, Labor in Australia and the UK came from a broad union movement. Within 20 years, it was capable of winning at least a significant minority of seats. The Greens seem to be on that kind of 10% vote plateau nationally. What do you think is the thing that will either drive the Greens being able to replace the bastards, or is it a question that, because you are targeting a very specific set of voters, you might only get 10 or 15% of the vote. Obviously not in Canberra.
I think there's a couple of interesting issues embedded in that. Firstly, the environment movement, in the way the union movement really backed the ALP, and I think that built a lot of strength for the Labor Party quite quickly, and that was really important for their growth and continues to do so. Whereas in Australia, the environment movement has always been a bit torn, particularly if you sort of go back to the Hawke, Richardson era, where they really embraced the environment movement. And so the environment movement has not backed the Green Party, which is sort of its political wing if you take that theory, in the same way the union movement backed the ALP. And I think has curtailed the Greens to some extent, if I'm frank about it. And the second part of that was, I think that's also where some of the debate is going in the party at the moment around, and you'll see this criticism, the Greens should stick to their knitting and focus on the environment, versus those who say, no, we're actually a broad-based party of the left. The platform's always had all those other elements in it, but the media perception is it's an environment party. But issues like refugees or drug law reform or some of those other things are actually really important to our base as well. And so that's where the competition becomes more clear, I think, or that it becomes more evident, because the Labor Party would say there's some of their values as well.
Yeah, well, you'd know a lot more than me, but I guess the question about the Greens pushing past 10% is, winning parts of the small L Liberal middle class. So Green attempts to win votes in seats like Higgins, seats like Wentworth and Sydney, I guess. And I think that's where a big structural dilemma will be, where that seems like the most obvious next patch of votes for Greens parties to win. But then that really puts you in structural conflict within your party, within the people who are broad lefties and who wouldn't live in Higgins for quids. So I think that will be, if the Greens do want to go beyond that 10% part of the population, I think that will be the big question.
Actually, Sean just reminds me, I think the other thing we're seeing in demographics and the research that's going is that younger voters particularly are less attached. You're not seeing the great tribalism that you saw in politics in previous decades, and younger voters will move around much more, and I think we're going to see that'll mean that electoral success will be much more based on both personality contest and ideas contest. And I think people will be more fluid in their voting allegiances, which offers greater opportunity, perhaps greater threat to the ALP because they don't have that rusted on group. And I think issues like climate change, as the impacts of that come through and start to have some very serious consequences, will potentially trigger significant voter change. But there may be other issues that emerge as well, things like artificial intelligence and all those kind of things, which will also drive Labor to discussions which will more naturally favour the ALP.
Okay, I think we've come to that time when the Progressive Publisher has asked me to remind you that you can't get through the door. See the gentleman is guarding the door until you've got your second copy. It's the Christmas copy to give away to others. Sean and Shane, thank you both very much. Please join me in thanking both of you.